Hey, and just a quick reminder that the audio-only versions of these Vital MX interviews are available on the Vital MX podcast page. Search for it anywhere you get your pods and let your friends know about it. Okay, guys, I'm back. Dark Side here with Vital MX. Today, I've got Bruce Hendel. He is the Senior Vice President Global Sales for VP Racing Fuels, Race Fuels, and Consumer Products. What's going on, Bruce?
Well, it's a little overcast and rainy here in San Antonio. Still wish I was out in Southern California because the riding's a bit better.
Let's talk about you a little bit. I was told you have a bit of a background in motocross or dirt bikes. So what'd you grow up doing? How'd you get into moto?
Well, late in life, for the two-wheel side, my parents weren't big on motorcycles. And so interesting story, one summer when I was in college, so it tells you how late in life it was for me to get involved. But,
right.
I earned some decent money. And so what I do with that money, I went out and bought a motorcycle. I bought a Honda XR 250. And I put it in the garage, and I went over to my girlfriend's house, and I called my parents from my girlfriend's house and told them there was a motorcycle in the garage because they didn't want to be home when they found out.
Okay.
So that was the start for me. I probably a lot younger than that. I was probably on a mini bike and enjoyed it, but my parents were never going to buy me one. So anyway, that kind of got me started on it. And then when I moved to the Midwest, I grew up on the East Coast originally. And when I moved to the Midwest for the job that I had then, I went to the local store and I said, I want to do some racing. And I know the Midwest has got to have some motocross tracks. So let me check out the scene. I went down to the local store. It was Thompson's Motorsports. Chad Thompson, who owns that now, is a very good friend of mine. Anyway, I walked in the store and I said, "Hey, what's the racing scene like around here?" I said, "Oh, yeah, we got motocross all the time throughout India." This was in Indiana when I was in the Midwest. So we race they got racing, a couple different tracks every weekend, District 15. It's a great deal. I said, all right. And I'm figuring, well, hell, I want to go out there and win. So I got to have whatever bike's got the most power. That's what it's going to take. So I, of course, picked the CR 500.
Oof.
So I never rode a 125 two-stroke. I never remember I had an XR 250 before this. I never rode a 125 two-stroke, a 250 two-stroke. Went right for the 500. Showed up my first race, and I said, yeah, I want to sign up for the novice class. And they don't have novice classes for 500.
This is great.
So I kind of learned the hard way. I made some good friends right away. All guys on 500s became good friends. Actually, my brother-in-law, who I was really good friends with him before I knew he had a sister, and I married a sister. But anyway, we became really good friends, and he rode a 500. He taught me a lot about riding, and we raced every weekend. We were racing every Saturday, every Saturday and every Sunday through the race season, and ended up finishing second in the Open BC class for District 15 that year.
Very cool.
So kind of an interesting story. I'm not going to say that I was really, really that good. I think I just raced so much. I scored a lot of points.
Hey, consistency.
But yeah, it is consistency. So that's basically how I got started on the moto side. And then just kind of really enjoyed doing moto, and then got an opportunity to take a job with VP Racing Fuels back in 93. Give you an idea how long I've been with the company. So I'm on my 30th year. So I went out to the West Coast to take a job with VP, running their West Coast division, and got introduced to some other forms of racing, mainly desert racing. So we started doing some desert racing. The first desert race, remember, I jumped into something with both feet, right? Like I bought the CR 500 for my first moto.
Sounds that way,
so
yeah.
The first desert race I decided to do, I said, I'm going to do Vegas to Reno.
Oh my
Never
God.
done a desert race before. That's 540 miles. Guys know that race that kind of stuff out west. And I suckered my brother-in-law in to come out there and race it with me. and our goal was to finish, and we finished ninth out of like 21 or 22 entries in our class, and so that wasn't bad. We learned a lot of stuff. We learned, what we need to do differently when we go back out to race that kind of race again. We thought, oh, desert race, you got plenty of time. It's 540-mile sprint race. Every second counts. And so we didn't have quick fill tanks. We didn't have the right rider change strategy. We could have had 3 riders on the team. Instead, we just did it with him and I. So we changed the strategy, and 2 years later, we went back out and won it. So,
oh, very cool.
Yeah. And then I raced it again later on in a different age group in like the over 40 expert class at one point in time. Gary Jones, I'm sure the older folks that are listening to this know who Gary Jones is. Another good friend of mine. He's a 4-time, national AMA champion from AMA Outdoor National champion from the 70s. We raced it together and won in a different age group. So I've done that race. Actually won Vegas to Reno 3 times, I think, in the class that we were racing in.
That is insanely impressive.
It's way more dangerous than moto. I know it probably doesn't seem like it, because in moto you got all kinds of, the jumps and all that other stuff that you're dealing with and the whoops, but it's the high speed stuff and the stuff you can't see. At least in moto, what's coming because the track. In desert, you don't know what's coming. And it's way more dangerous.
I can't argue with that.
I don't do that anymore. Now you just ride for fun. But you like to go to the track and go ride for a couple hours and go home and do some other things for that day. But,
sure.
The one thing that I have done, because I've never raced in Mexico, down in Baja. I've been down there. We've been servicing races since the early 90s, and when Bruce Ogilvie was racing, and then Johnny Campbell, and we saw involved with all those guys, Danny Hamill and so on. And, but never raced down there. Always wanted to do it, but, always too busy with providing the fuel service for it. And then, I don't remember it's somewhere in the early 2000s or mid 2000s, somewhere around there. Cameron Steele invited me on this little ride that he was putting together called Rip to Cabo. I don't know if you've heard of it or not.
I have.
But we ride the whole peninsula from the U.S.-Mexico border all the way down to Cabo, all off-road. And it's not a race. It's just a ride, but it's a fast-paced group of guys. And so you're covering a lot of ground. You're doing like 300-plus off-road miles a day for 5 to 6 days. So it's a challenge in and of itself. But you see a lot more of the country. When you're racing down there, you got tunnel vision. You only see what's on the course. This just allows you to enjoy off-road riding a lot more. And it's a hell of an experience, especially going down the peninsula. The terrain is just beautiful, and you're literally in the middle of nowhere. It's awesome.
Yeah, it sounds beautiful. I've seen just some video of stuff like that, and very, very cool. With VP Racing Fuels has been around for 40-plus years, I believe. You've been there around
almost getting close to 50. Started in 1975.
Ooh, that's when I was born. So that's way too close to 50. Way too close. But you've been there around close to, you said right at 30 years. What did you know about fuel at the time? Did you have to learn everything pretty much from scratch, or did you have a little bit of background on understanding the chemistry of fuel?
I didn't have much. I was a fan of the sport, and of motorsports in general, especially the 2-wheel side, and enjoyed being involved in it. My background was always been in accounting, from education, accounting, and sales, and experience-wise was always in the sales side of it and running a business. And so I just got lucky. At the time, I had a parts and accessory store and a KTM dealership in Indiana. And I was selling VP race fuel at the time. And I went to get some inventory from our local warehouse and ended up meeting the president and owner, 2 different people at the time of VP Racing Fuels, and just had an open chat with them, and we hit it off real well. And I ended the conversation by saying, if there's ever any opportunities, back east or out west, let me know. You might say that to 100 different people and nobody ever calls you on it. And the next day I got a message. Hey, we want to talk to you about the West Coast.
That's
and
impressive.
For me, the West Coast, I'm an East Coast boy growing up, right? So as far as I was concerned, the country ended at the Rocky Mountains. That's as far as I needed to go to get good skiing. So going past that, I never even considered it. But this position was located in California, and I made the decision to take the position, not knowing much about the product itself, although it was in the was in the category of what I enjoyed doing as a hobby, right?
Mm-hmm.
And my business background that I had by education and experience, I thought it was a good fit for me, and moved out to the West Coast and was out there for almost 21 years before transferring to the corporate office here in San Antonio.
Okay. Well, VP is recognized as probably the most well-known, the leader really in race fuels. How do you feel like VP got there, and what sets them apart? What sets you guys apart from other fuel companies?
Well, if you go back to a little bit of the history of the company, how it got started, it was started by a gentleman by the name of Steve Burns, and he was a racer himself. He enjoyed or raced motorcycles as well as drag cars. Okay. And so he thought there's got to be something better that could be done with performance fuels. He was kind of self-taught, it wasn't by education, but he went and did some research and started blending some things up in his garage and brought it to the racetrack and did some testing and started testing with guys like on the drag race side, like Warren Johnson. If anybody follows drag racing, you've heard of that name before. And a couple other guys, and they really helped him in testing a lot of the fuels to prove them out. And that's basically how the company got started. And even he was friends with Kent Howerton. So Kent Howerton, another local Texas guy from this area, right?
Yep.
And obviously a national champion. They got hooked up with Kent Howerton and kind of got in that group of racers to where I think Yamaha might have been one of the first factory teams. It was either Yamaha or Kawasaki might have been one of the first factory teams to run our fuel, even in the late 70s. I've got a poster in my office here signed. It's a 1978 poster signed from Bob Hanna. So that's kind of how we got it started into the two-wheel side, basically between factory Yamaha and Kawasaki, running our fuels back in the late 70s. And then the drag racing side, some of the contacts that Steve Burns had that helped him with testing, and just the word went through the pits and the paddock about how well these fuels perform. And back then we started with one fuel. We had C12. That was the first fuel we ever made. We still have that fuel today, along with 79 others.
Right. Well, speaking of those lines, specifically with Supercross and Motocross, Pro 6 is like a staple. How does the development of a fuel, let's say just that line of fuel, Pro 6, how does that develop over the years, progress, or change over time?
So you probably have to go back before Pro 6. So we go back to the two-stroke days. Pretty much everybody was running our C12. The majority of the teams are running our C12, whether it be Honda, Kawasaki, Yamaha, even the support teams, Pro Circuit. They were all running our C12. It was kind of like the staple in the two-stroke performance market. And then in the mid 90s, AMA changed the fuel rule, and they allowed a certain amount of oxygen in the fuel. So the fuel rule back then was no oxygen was allowed. Well, in pump gas had oxygen in it, so the AMA didn't want to have a fuel rule where somebody, if they chose to run pump gas, would be illegal. For the record, we advised against it because we thought from our standpoint, looking out for the racer, that it would end up making race fuel more expensive, even though it would be to our benefit, because what we do is do custom fuels, make the best fuel that we can under the rule. But we advised against allowing an oxygen rule that will allow us to make better performing fuels than what we have now. Remember, the AMA didn't want somebody to go from pump gas to race fuel just because of a rule. Mm-hmm. So that's what they were thinking. It was probably not the right way to think, because if you went down the start line on a pro motocross race, there wasn't anybody running pump gas anyway. So it really shouldn't have been a concern. But they made the rule change, and obviously our job is to make the best fuel we can out of the rule. So we then introduced MR2 back in the mid-90s, and it was more expensive, but it made really, really good power, way better power than C12 could make, because now you're allowing oxygen. Oxygen, when you can do things with oxygen, you can make more power, okay? So MR2 became kind of the staple for motocross. And then again, as the rules changed, the AMA went to an unleaded rule. So now we had to change the fuel again. And once they went to an unleaded rule, then we formulated, and it may not have been MR Pro 6 initially. I think it might have been MR Pro 4, and then Pro 5, and now Pro 6, and soon to come Pro 7. But we're constantly trying to figure out ways and do R&D and work with the teams to improve whatever formulas that we have. Sometimes within the rules, they're so narrow, it's very, very difficult to make big improvements. You can only make small improvements, but improvements nonetheless. So that's why when we started out, before Pro 6, there was Pro 5, and then there was Pro 4. And they're just evolution of the product. As you figure out ways to try to tweak it, and maybe you find some other components that you didn't think of that could be used before. You try different things, and you sometimes you get lucky and you stumble across something that works really well. But I think that's the advantage that we have. We have our own in-house chemists. We have our own lab. We have our own dynos here. We still work with the factory teams. You have to prove out at that level, right? Whatever we do in the lab, you still have to go out on the track and prove that it works with a professional rider and a professional team. And because we have those long-term relationships with the factories, we validate the product with competition.
When it comes to the factory teams, how much test fuel do they get for, let's say, a season? Does it vary?
Well, they have fuel that they race on, and they don't really get test fuel unless we're working on a particular project. So they have the regular fuel that they race on. And I'm assuming you're talking about, like, if we're looking at improving something when you say test fuel.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's kind of goes in steps, right? Because we have a theory that something may work, so we blend it up. We run it on our dyno to say, okay, we saw an improvement there. Look, I go back. I use an example when I was in Mitch Payton's shop many, many years ago, back in the two-stroke days. Not everything you do or you try or you think works. They're not all winners. And I remember seeing a trash can full of cylinder heads at Mitch's place. Those were all the ones that didn't work, right?
Yeah, sure.
As you're trying to find power and things to make the improvements, it's a lot of trial and error. So, we try to validate it in-house. We think we have something that works better. And then we'll make a small batch, and then we'll typically give 5 or 10 gallons to various teams to run on the dyno to give us feedback. First thing we have to make sure is, does it do what we think it's supposed to do on the dyno at the factory level, right?
Right.
So, and they may give us some feedback and say, you know what, this gained a little bit here, was a little bit better on the top end, not as good on the bottom end. Maybe it fell off altogether. We don't know. Whatever the feedback is, we take that back to the lab and the chemists. We give them the information, and then we go, okay, let's try tweaking it this way. And then we send some more test samples out. So typically it starts out where somebody will get just 5 or 10 gallons to try on the dyno. And then once it looks good on the dyno still doesn't replicate racing conditions. So then we have to go out and use it in the field. And typically we prefer hot conditions on a motocross type track, not supercross. Supercross doesn't put enough stress on the product because you're just on and off the throttle. You're not on the throttle all that often. Any type of racing where you're kind of pinned wide open for long periods of time puts a lot more stress on the fuel. So outdoor type testing is more relevant for us than supercross testing.
Do you set up blind tests? Like, here's 3 different fuel types, different batches. Tell us which one works best.
We do. A lot of times we'll send, A and B samples and maybe A, B, and C samples and try to get a consensus from different teams, hoping that they all go, they all like A or they all like B better, right? So there's some consistency
right
in the feedback. And then it gives you direction. And maybe you limit it down to an A and B next time. And then maybe it's down to A. And then you take, okay, we got A. And now we run it head to head against what we have in the field currently. That's production.
This is something I've gotten from mechanics sometimes or suspension guys. And they'll take their rider and they'll say, all right, I made a change. Go see if you like it better. And they come back, oh, I love it. And then mechanic's like, yeah, I didn't change anything.
Yeah, you didn't change anything. Yeah. I knew that was coming.
Yeah. So do you guys do anything like that? Like, here's 3 different fuels. Which one do you like? They were all the same.
No, we don't. We don't do that. Okay. We haven't done that because I think we know that on the dyno it works better. And sometimes before we go in the field, we want to know that it works better on the dyno.
Yeah.
And the main thing for testing in the field is to make sure that under the stress of racing, that you don't have anything weird happen, like the fuel doesn't get too hot and starts to overheat and then causes you to lose power towards the end of the moto. Because you got to remember, you got to control what you want to control is any vapor lock problems, right? So if you look at the bike, the design of a bike is not the best for keeping heat out of the fuel. Fuel sits above a heat source, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that heat radiates up into the fuel tank. So most of the pros they'll line the underside of the tanks with heat reflective tape. They'll do everything they can to isolate the gas tank from the heat that's being reflected up in it. Because later on in the moto, as that volume of the fuel decreases, you've got less mass. So less mass can't dissipate the heat as well. So the fuel tends to get warmer and warmer and warmer. And so towards the end of the moto, the challenge is you don't want a fuel that's going to fall off or lose power as it gets hotter towards the end of a moto. So you have to have a balance. So like you said, you can run on the dyno and go, man, that looks good on the dyno. And then you go out in the field and find out, it didn't really perform well. That's why you got to do both. It's just not a dyno. Different
factors involved, obviously. Yeah. Do teams give you requests for what they need performance-wise? We need a little more on the bottom. We need a little bit, whatever the necessity is.
No, not really. They know that if we can supply under the fuel rules, and granted the pro level fuels aren't cheap. They're not inexpensive by any means, but the value of the horsepower that they do generate over a traditional fuel or even pump gas, the factories would have to spend hundreds and thousands of dollars to try to find the power.
Mm.
So if you can pour it in, that's easy horsepower at almost any price.
Right. Okay.
But interestingly enough, the 450s make so much power now that they're more concerned about the usability of the power because the rider's having a hard time just hanging on to those bikes now. But yet you go to the 250 and they go, whatever power you can find us, we want.
Right.
And you still have to have a fuel that works. You want to have a fuel that is good for both because you don't really want a 450 fuel and a 250 fuel. So they don't really request power in certain areas. They want clean throttle response. They don't want it to bog down in the face of a jump, obviously. So you don't want anything that would cause that. And just good good crisp throttle response and good power.
Okay. Is there an average cost to develop a particular fuel? So if you tomorrow decide, well, we're going to work on this fuel line, we're going to try to come up with something different, and it may or may not work, is there an average cost that you guys know this is what it's going to take? Could be a loss, could be a gain in the end. How does that end of it work?
Honestly, it's an interesting question, because I don't know that we've ever thought about it that way. So I don't know that we've ever gone into a project to improve something and say, hey, you know what? It's just going to cost too much. We're not going to do it.
Right.
We're all about trying to make our products better. And in general, it's not that expensive because of a lot of the people that we work with that can give us feedback. Yeah, we've got our in-house time, we got our R&D folks, but hell, that's what we hire them for. That's the way I look at it.
Mm-hmm.
So they're there to help improve the product, or they're there to, a lot of times the sales team will get with our lab and our R&D people and say, hey, look, this is what we're trying to do. This is the fuel rule we're trying to meet. This is the octane level I think we need based on the the engine application. And because the lab doesn't really know, the lab takes direction from the sales team as to what we're trying to accomplish, and then the lab kind of builds some formulas based on what our goals are. I give you an interesting project that we've been working on, and it's been an expensive one. This is one of the ones that has been pretty expensive to do, and that's with the renewable fuels they're becoming more and more prominent. They're not really ready for prime time. When I say that, because of a price standpoint, they're not for everybody. They're not for the average guy that wants to go out racing, because right now they're just too expensive. Okay. And they're not, quite frankly, they're not as good as what we have now. They're not as clean. The octane levels aren't as good. But it is kind of the way things are moving to be more environmentally friendly, so to speak. And we have a lot of fuels that fit that category, but the one we're working on is with the IMSA sports car series. They're requiring a 80% renewable. So to give you an idea, most of the renewables in the United States right now that are available from anybody are about a 20% renewable. So 80% is a big jump. So a lot of these components, we have to source them outside the United States because they aren't available in the United States, and then we have to bring them in and we have to blend them, and so that's been a project, and that's working with OEMs like Porsche, BMW, Acura, and General Motors. It's actually been a fun project, and because we had a short timeline to try to accomplish this, because we're launching it in 2023, and we really just started about 6 months ago, 6 or 7 months ago, on this, and so that will be a product that will be run in the GTP class, which is the top class of the IMSA series, this coming year in 2023. But that whole process was very interesting. That took a lot. We had to get approval from the EPA to bring in certain components that have never been brought into the country before, and so it was, like I said, it was very interesting. The good thing is, even though it was expensive, we're the official fuel of IMSA, so we have a long-term contract to supply fuel for that, and it is a spec fuel for the series. So even though we invested quite a bit of money in it, we'll get our return on investment because of the long-term relationship that we have with the series, and it will lead to other renewable fuels in the future for other series.
Is that the future? Renewable fuels?
I think at some level. I mean, I don't know if it's right around the corner.
Right.
It's because they're not, like I said, they're not as good, and they'll never be as cost effective. So I kind of look at it this way, right? So you look at just go grocery shopping, right? You can buy an organic apple or non-organic apple. You're always going to pay more for an organic apple.
That is true.
And they were probably a lot more costly when it first started, and now they've come down, but it still costs more money. So I think the public's just going to have to make a choice of what their budget is at some point, and that'll dictate the market.
Okay, well, staying on cost, and you talked about this a little while ago, fuel is expensive in general. Race fuel is somewhat out of reach for the average consumer sometimes, or just the weekend warrior. Is race fuel that much better on the equipment? Should a weekend warrior use race fuel if possible, or for a guy like that, does it make that much difference?
I look at it a little bit differently. First of all, I look at race fuel. I don't look at it as a comparison to pump gas. And a lot of people do this. Oh, pump gas. If you're in California, you're paying, I don't know, what, $5 or $6 a gallon now just for regular pump gas. But, I look at it as another performance part. Okay. So I know anybody that cares about their equipment is buying top name brand lubricants for their motorcycle. They're not going and buying generic oil at a gas station for their motorcycle.
That's true.
Those are my buying habits. I think my buying habits are probably mimic most other people that are enthusiasts in the motorcycle market. But you're going to buy a motorcycle specific name brand lubricant, and you're paying probably 2 or 3 times more than a generic quart of oil that you can find at a discount store. Okay.
Yep. That's accurate.
So race fuel is a performance part. So we spend a lot of time worrying about the lubricant that we put in it, and we don't think anything about the fuel we put in it, but yet we run a lot more fuel through it than we do oil. Using a good fuel can really reduce wear and tear. There's a lot of pump gas in general is not very clean. If I could show you guys a gas chromatograph and kind of explain it to you visually, it's a really, really good visual. But a gas chromatograph breaks down all the components in a fuel. We have that in our lab. So you put a pump gas in a gas chromatograph, and you'll get all these peaks. It looks like a little seismograph reading. It's finding all these components. I don't know how to read it. That's why we have chemists that know how to read it.
Yeah.
But every point that pops up on the gas chromatograph is a component in the fuel. Now you go through and you put in our racing fuel, and it has 90% less of whatever it's finding in pump gas. So a lot of times with pump gas, has a lot of gums and varnishes, and they're loaded with detergents to fight the gums and varnishes. And now you got ethanol in it. And if the bike sits for too long, ethanol brings in moisture and can cause corrosion in your fuel system. So there's a lot of things that aren't good about using pump gas. And then one of the first things we all do, I know I've done it, we go out and buy a pipe. No, bike's got a perfectly good pipe that came with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we all go out and buy a pipe, spend $1,500, and not saying that we shouldn't, because those are great performance upgrades. But I can make more power with fuel than a pipe.
That's a good point, and you're right.
We don't really think that's what I'm talking about. Nobody's thinking about fuel as a performance part.
Yeah, I think because it's not visual, right? The pipe looks cool.
It's cool. You can show your buddies the new carbon fiber end cap
yes,
or whatever. But guess what? You can't dent fuel. So you can dent pipes, and then you don't have the performance that you had. You got to go out and replace them, you got to repack them. But every time you pour fuel in there, you got the same performance.
That's a fantastic point. I love it.
So, and I know sometimes it's just not practical. If you're a guy on a moto guy, you don't really go through a lot of fuel, and the incremental cost to some probably isn't that much. To others, it could be. And what I would say is, if you want to stretch it out a little bit, at least do a 50-50 mix. You'll still feel a difference in performance. And then when it comes to race day, if you want to stretch a buck on practice, use a 50-50 blend, pump gas and race gas. And then on race day, just go 100% race.
Huh. Okay. Yeah, that's smart.
I'll give you a good example. Back when 4-strokes first came out, back in the mid to late 90s. We knew that change was coming when Doug Henry was starting to win some Supercross races on the YZ400, right? One of the magazines. I'll say one of the magazines because you guys are basically competing instead of the actual magazine name.
Sure.
So one of the magazines came out with an article. I call it the 10 Commandments of four-stroke, right? And one of the top 3 was thou shalt not run race fuel.
Oh.
So, see, they didn't understand, okay? They were coming from the two-stroke side of it, just thinking octane. Because if you had a two-stroke, even a lot of the stock bikes, without any modifications, a lot of the stock two-strokes couldn't run pump gas. They would detonate on pump gas, so you had to run a race fuel. So from an octane standpoint, four-strokes don't need as much octane as two-strokes, typically. But you're not running, octane is only one of the reasons why you may need to run a better fuel. The real reason is you want better performance. Everything we do, whatever we're buying because hoping that it's going to give us better performance, right?
Right.
Our four-stroke fuel that we designed when that era was changing, we were one of the first companies to come out with a specific four-stroke racing fuel. It was designed for the factory motocross team at the time. And then we said, man, that stuff's real expensive. What can we do? Because we don't have to worry about the fuel rules for the average person. What can we do to get that kind of performance for four strokes for the average guy that just wants to go out and ride? And that's when we came out with the U4 product, which we still have today. And we also supplement that with T4. But those fuels are pour-in replacements for pump gas, and they will make a big difference. So when I got a hold of the guys at the magazine and I said, you guys are missing the boat. You're thinking about the octane. You're not thinking about the performance, okay? We all want performance. Performance is determined on the dyno. Octane doesn't mean horsepower. Octane doesn't mean more horsepower on the dyno. Octane means you can do things to your engine to help generate more power, but octane in and of itself is not generating more horsepower, okay? So the four-stroke fuels were designed with lower octane, but a lot more energy. And that's why they make more power. So I finally got those guys to test it, put it on the dyno. And, a lot of articles throughout history, throughout the years, repeat themselves, right? Because they always have new people that get involved with moto. So, how to change a tire, right? Those articles repeat themselves. How to change your oil, those articles repeat themselves. So they did another update of the 10 Commandments of four-stroke, 4 years later after the first one came out. In the top 3, thou shalt run U4.
Fantastic.
So I proved it on the dyno and on the track that it is a performance part.
This has been very informative, Bruce. I really appreciate you coming on here and talking about it a little bit because I've learned a lot. And this was very interesting.
We've been involved and we still are involved with the factory teams today, Factory Honda, Pro Circuit, Yamaha through the Star program now, the Star Racing program, the Kawasaki factory program, the KTM gas and Husqvarna off-road team, not the motocross side, but the off-road teams. And that extends out to a lot of the power sports, other forms of power sports, right? So a lot of the UTV stuff we're involved with at the factory level and even the snow machine market as well. And really enjoy that market. It's obviously near and dear to our heart because we started back in the late 70s, like I said, with Yamaha and Kawasaki. And to this day, we still have those two teams are running our product for almost since we've been in business.
It's very impressive. I think everybody recognizes the VP logo and sees the marketing and what you guys, how you've been a part of the sports and all motorsports for, like you said, since 75. That's pretty impressive. And this has been very informative. So thank you so much for taking some time for us today. Yeah,
no problem. If I could get in one more moment.
Yep.
I just want to let you know that let everybody know that's listening that although we started out on the race fuel side, and that's where we built our business. We have expanded into a lot of other products in the last 10 to 12 years. So I'm more so on the consumer product side, but also a lot on the performance side as well. On the performance side, we now have a full line of performance lubricants and performance coolants and racing brake fluid. And our Stay Frosty performance coolant is awesome. And we've got fuel for outdoor power equipment. So any of you out there that have outdoor power equipment, you can find our products in like Lowe's, Home Depot, Tractor Supply. Pump gas wreaks havoc on that outdoor power equipment, especially in areas where you have equipment that sits for the off season. You go in the winter and you park your lawnmowers and trimmers and all that kind of stuff, and you bring them out in the springtime, and a lot of times they won't run. And it's because of the poor pump gas that we have now. And this product is good for 2 years in the equipment and like 5 years in the can. So you take your product out in the spring, or in the case of snow blowers, you pull them out in the winter, or generators that have been sitting for a while. If you have this small engine fuel in it, starts every time. You'll never have to bring it into the shop to get fuel related repairs. It's like for the 2-stroke guys, we got it pre-mixed at 40 to 1 and 50 to 1, the equipment that requires that, as well as 4-cycle. So figure I'll let everybody know about that, because we are a bit more than race fuel, and a lot of people just know us for race fuel, and we've got a lot of other really cool products now.
Absolutely. Well, once again, thank you for your time, and I appreciate you coming on here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Anytime, man. Thank you, Bruce.
Yep. Take care.